New York, December 16, 1985. The streets are cold. The sidewalks glisten under winter streetlights, and Sparks Steakhouse is alive with the hum of businessmen, tourists, and regulars who've been dining here for years. But tonight, in front of this Midtown Manhattan landmark, something will happen that will not only dominate headlines, but alter the balance of power in the American Mafia forever. It will be a moment captured in whispers, retold in courtrooms, analyzed by FBI agents, and replayed endlessly in the minds of those who lived it. The assassination of Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, carried out in the middle of rush-hour traffic. And behind it all, orchestrating the coup, was a man who would become both a legend and a cautionary tale, John Gotti. The Gotti-Castellano hit is often framed as a simple mobster kills boss story, an internal power grab. But that's a surface-level take. This was more than a murder. This was the visible fracture point between two mafia philosophies, the quiet, business-oriented, low-profile approach perfected by bosses like Carlo Gambino, and the loud, street-hardened, media-savvy style that John Gotti would come to personify. To understand why this hit happened, and why it reverberated so violently through organized crime in America, we have to go back years before Sparks Steakhouse ever served its first steak that December evening. Paul Castellano wasn't just any boss. He was Carlo Gambino's hand-picked successor. Castellano was a businessman first. He built his influence through control of unions, construction contracts, and legitimate-looking companies that served as perfect covers for illegal rackets. He didn't like street guys in the traditional sense. He viewed them as crude, unpredictable, and most dangerously, as magnets for law enforcement attention. John Gotti, on the other hand, was a street guy. Born and bred in the working-class neighborhoods of Queens, he cut his teeth hijacking trucks, running illegal gambling operations, and earning his reputation the hard way, through violence, loyalty to his crew, and the ability to make money in the shadows. To Gotti, respect was earned with a mix of charm, fear, and visibility. So how did these two end up on a collision course? When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, many in the family, especially those close to underboss Agnello Neil Della Croce, expected Neil to take over. Della Croce was old school, a killer when necessary, a diplomat when possible, and someone who understood the balance between violence and restraint. But Gambino shocked the family by bypassing Della Croce and handing the top job to Castellano. This was a political decision. Castellano's rise wasn't about street credentials, it was about steering the family deeper into white-collar crime. The era of hijackings and bold hits was fading, at least in Carlo's eyes, and he believed Castellano could shield the family from the kind of FBI scrutiny that had destroyed other criminal empires. But the seeds of resentment were planted right there. Della Croce, ever the loyal soldier, accepted the decision and kept his faction in line for a while. By the early 1980s, cracks in Castellano's strategy began to show. His mansion on Todd Hill in Staten Island, nicknamed the White House, became a symbol of his detachment from the rank and file. Meetings were formal, with gourmet meals prepared by his personal chef. Rules were strict: no drugs, no unnecessary violence, and certainly no making headlines. On paper, these rules made sense. Drugs carried mandatory sentences that could bury a soldier for life, and violence always risked drawing the NYPD and FBI closer. But in practice, these rules alienated men like Gotti, whose crews were making serious money from heroin and cocaine distribution. Castellano's ban wasn't about morality, it was about control. If you were dealing drugs without his blessing, you were not only risking heat, you were challenging his authority. It was inevitable that Gotti's operations would come under Castellano's scrutiny. Wiretaps and FBI surveillance soon captured conversations from Gotti's crew discussing narcotics deals. These tapes made their way to Castellano, and by late 1985, word was spreading. Gotti was in trouble. Castellano reportedly told close associates he was considering demoting Gotti, or worse, shelving him entirely. A mafia death sentence, even if it didn't involve literal murder. And then came the turning point, December 20, 1985. Agnello Della Croce, Gotti's protector, and the man who had kept the family from splitting apart, died of cancer. His funeral was a show of unity, but beneath the surface it marked the removal of the last buffer between Castellano and Gotti. Without Della Croce, Gotti had a choice: accept whatever punishment Castellano had in store, or make the first move. From a historian's perspective, this decision wasn't made in a vacuum. There was precedent for replacing a boss. The Commission, the Mafia's governing body, had rules about killing bosses, but they weren't ironclad. In theory, you needed Commission approval. In practice, if you moved fast, struck decisively, and consolidated power immediately afterward, you could survive the political fallout. This is exactly what Gotti planned. In the days after Della Croce's funeral, Gotti met with trusted allies, including Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano and Frankie Lock Locascio. They weighed the risks. Killing Castellano without commission approval could spark a war, but allowing Castellano to act first would almost certainly mean Gotti's removal and possibly his death. The hit was a gamble, but in Gotti's eyes it was the only play worth making. The plan was bold and cinematic in its simplicity: lure Castellano to a meeting, ambush him in a public place, and eliminate him along with his new underboss Tommy Bellotti. The location, Sparks Steakhouse, where Castellano was set to meet Capo Thomas Gambino on December 16th. The choice of Sparks was as much psychological as tactical. Midtown Manhattan during rush hour, guaranteed witnesses. It guaranteed shock value. This was a statement hit, the kind that would send a clear message to anyone doubting Gotti's resolve. At approximately 5:26 p.m., Castellano's black Lincoln town car pulled up to the curb outside Sparks. Snow dusted the sidewalks and the air was thick with holiday season energy. As Castellano stepped out of the car, 4 gunmen approached. No words were exchanged. The shots came fast, hitting both Castellano and Bellotti before they could react. Witnesses reported seeing the gunman walk away calmly, blending into the crowd. The precision and speed of the attack suggested careful rehearsal. Within minutes, the scene was chaos, sirens, flashing lights, and a growing throng of onlookers. New York's most powerful mob boss was dead, lying on the sidewalk of one of the city's busiest streets. What happened next was a textbook example of how quickly power can shift in organized crime. Within 72 hours, John Gotti was in control of the Gambino family. There was no civil war, no prolonged bloodletting. By striking first and striking hard, Gotti had not only removed his enemy, but also positioned himself as the undisputed leader. But this is where our historian's lens complicates the popular narrative. Was this hit a stroke of genius, or a catastrophic miscalculation? Counterpoint 1. Gotti's reign brought unprecedented attention from law enforcement. Castellano's low-profile style had kept the family relatively insulated. Gotti's high-profile persona, tailored suits, nightly visits to the Ravenite social club, willingness to talk to the press made him a target. Within a few years, the same visibility that cemented his legend also sealed his fate. Counterpoint 2. While Gotti was undeniably charismatic and effective at consolidating power in the short term, his decision to bypass the commission weakened the Mafia's internal governance. It set a precedent for settling scores outside the established channels, contributing to instability across the 5 families. Yet the rebuttal to both points is rooted in survival. From Gotti's perspective in December 1985, this wasn't about long-term political stability. It was about living to see January 1986. Castellano had the tapes. Castellano had the motive. Waiting would have been suicide. From the inside looking out, Gotti's move wasn't just survival. It was an assertion of a very specific philosophy about what the Mafia was supposed to be. For Castellano, the mob was an organization. The less you bled in the streets, the longer you could operate. The less you flaunted, the less you risked attracting the FBI's microscope. For Gotti, the mob was about power, presence, and earning, and about not letting anyone, even the boss, make you beg for your position. The irony is that both approaches were rooted in protecting the family. Castellano thought white-collar insulation was the shield. Gotti believed strength and fear were the shield. What Gotti didn't fully calculate was that in the late 1980s, neither shield worked against a government that had finally sharpened its tools. By 1985, the RICO Act, passed in 1970 but weaponized in full force in the 80s, had become the FBI's scalpel for dismantling organized crime. Wiretaps, surveillance, and flipped witnesses could dismantle an empire from the inside out. Castellano's tapes proved that no matter how businesslike you were, if you talked in the wrong room you were vulnerable. And Gotti's swagger proved that even if you scared the streets into silence, you couldn't scare the federal government. Still, Gotti's rapid consolidation of power after Sparks was impressive. The transition looked almost corporate in its efficiency. Crews that might have resisted quickly fell in line, partly because they knew Gotti wasn't afraid to act, and partly because, at least initially, the money kept flowing. He cemented his control through 2 things: rewards and visibility. Loyalists got prime rackets and the best earning opportunities, and Gotti made sure his image was everywhere, in the clubs, in the neighborhoods, even in the press. That visibility was intoxicating for some members. Under Castellano, the Gambino family had felt insulated but invisible. Under Gotti, they were notorious. It was this shift from quiet dominance to public celebrity that made Gotti the Teflon Don, and it worked for a while. From a historian's perspective, the Sparks hit also has to be seen in the context of the Commission. This governing body, created in 1931 after the Castellamarese War by Lucky Luciano, was designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral boss assassination. The theory was simple: kill a boss without approval, and you risk a war between families. In Gotti's case, the speed of the hit and the tightness of his post-hit control meant the commission had no practical way to retaliate without destabilizing the entire New York Mafia. The other bosses, Vincent Shine and Gigante of the Genovese family, Anthony Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese family, and the Colombo and Bonanno leadership, may have been furious, but the alternative was chaos. There's a subtle point here that's often missed. Gotti didn't just kill Castellano, he killed Castellano and Bellotti. That second death mattered politically. By removing both the boss and the underboss in one move, he created a complete leadership vacuum, which he could immediately fill. Leaving Bellotti alive would have created a natural rallying point for Castellano loyalists. This double removal was as much about psychology as it was about strategy. However, not everyone fell in line forever. There were quiet grumblings from crews more loyal to Castellano's style, especially those in white-collar rackets who now found themselves under pressure to operate in the Gotti mold. Sammy Gravano later testified that Gotti's obsession with image started to slow down the actual business. Money was still being made, but the FBI surveillance was relentless. Every public appearance, every dinner at the Ravenite, was an opportunity for the feds to plant more bugs, take more photos, and flip more associates. The public execution at Sparks had signaled power, but it had also sent a flare into the sky for law enforcement. Look here, this is where the action is. From a counterfactual angle, something historians like to explore, we can ask, what if Gotti had bided his time? Could he have outmaneuvered Castellano politically? Could he have used the drug charges as leverage within the commission, instead of breaking its rules outright? Possibly, but the timeline was razor-thin. The tapes linking Gotti's crew to heroin distribution were damning. Castellano had already expressed intent to deal with Gotti decisively. In mob politics, knowing a hit is coming is rarely enough time to stop it unless you act first. And in December 1985, Gotti wasn't interested in patience. In the days immediately after Sparks, newspapers ran with the spectacle. The New York Daily News and New York Post splashed headlines about the brazen hit, accompanied by photos of the crime scene, the police investigation, and grainy shots of Gotti smiling at social events. The FBI knew instantly that Gotti was the main suspect, but proving it would take years. Inside the family, the move electrified younger members. Gotti seemed untouchable, the man who had stared down the boss and walked away with the crown. His legend grew. Street guys loved him. Civilians in his neighborhood called him a Robin Hood figure. Even some in rival families admired the audacity, at least until his growing celebrity began to draw all of them into the FBI's crosshairs. This is the paradox of the Sparks hit. It was both a masterstroke and the beginning of the end. It kept Gotti alive and in power for the rest of the decade, but it also accelerated the decline of the Mafia's invisibility, which had been its greatest protection for half a century. The move was brilliant in the moment, but corrosive in the long run. From an analytical standpoint, the assassination is a lens through which we can see the American Mafia's transition from a shadow economy into a law enforcement priority. Castellano's low profile couldn't save him. Gotti's high profile couldn't protect him forever. The world had changed. Surveillance was constant, RICO was lethal, and public hits in Manhattan would now guarantee not just headlines, but sustained federal pressure. In other words, Sparks wasn't just the end of Castellano, it was the beginning of the end for the old Mafia order in New York. In the months that followed the Sparks hit, John Gotti's consolidation of power was swift but carefully choreographed. He knew the optics mattered as much as the mechanics. Within the Gambino family, the message was clear. Loyalty would be rewarded, and disloyalty would be met with decisive action. Captains and crews who had backed Gotti in the coup were given prime earning opportunities, control over lucrative labor rackets, access to high-volume gambling operations, and favorable cuts from construction contracts. Those tied too closely to Castellano's white-collar network were kept in place if they could produce, but they were watched closely. Sammy Gravano's rise to underboss was particularly significant. Gravano was a hybrid, someone with street credibility, who also understood the intricacies of legitimate-looking businesses. His loyalty during the planning of the hit, and his calm in its aftermath, made him indispensable to Gotti. In many ways, Gravano was the bridge between the street earners and the business earners, helping Gotti maintain balance in the early years of his reign. Law enforcement's response was equally calculated. The FBI's New York office had been building cases against the five families for years, but Gotti's boldness gave them new ammunition, both literal and psychological. Surveillance resources were shifted toward Gambino operations. Informants were pressed harder for information. Every public move Gotti made became a potential evidence-gathering opportunity. One FBI agent later remarked that Gotti did half our work for us, simply by refusing to go underground. Unlike Castellano, who conducted business quietly in private residences, Gotti relished the scene at the Ravenite Social Club. This open-door approach allowed law enforcement to plant listening devices, tail associates and piece together the Gambino hierarchy in ways that had been far more challenging under Castellano's reign. From a cultural standpoint, Gotti's image was skyrocketing. The media dubbed him the Dapper Don for his expensive suits and perfectly groomed appearance, and later the Teflon Don when early prosecutions failed to stick. The public, especially in Queens, began to see him as a kind of outlaw celebrity, someone who embodied the rebellious spirit of old New York while thumbing his nose at authority. This popularity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it built a loyal base of supporters and emboldened his men. On the other, it fueled the resolve of federal prosecutors who now saw Gotti as the face of organized crime, a face they were determined to take down. It's important to stress how the Gotti-Castellano conflict was not an isolated duel, but a reflection of a deeper philosophical divide in organized crime. The old-school bosses, shaped by the post-Luciano Commission era, valued longevity over flash. They measured success not in headlines but in years of uninterrupted earning. The new-school street bosses, by contrast, sought to inspire loyalty through charisma and dominance, even if it meant taking greater risks. The Sparks hit was in essence a referendum on which approach would define the Mafia's next chapter. Gotti won the referendum, but in doing so he brought the risks of his model into full view. We can't overlook the role of the commission in what happened afterward. Though Gotti had violated the unwritten rule against killing a boss without permission, the other bosses had to weigh retaliation against pragmatism. By the time any formal response could have been organized, Gotti's control of the Gambinos was solidified, and open warfare risked destabilizing all 5 families. Instead, the Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo and Bonanno leadership chose a watch-and-wait approach. Some saw opportunity in Gotti's flamboyance, believing it would distract law enforcement from their own quieter operations. Others resented the way Gotti's style attracted attention to all of them, but kept their grievances behind closed doors. From a purely strategic perspective, Gotti's ability to pull off the hit and avoid immediate retribution was remarkable. It required not only precise coordination of the gunmen, but also airtight discipline among those who knew of the plan. The fact that the shooters were never definitively identified in court despite the high-profile nature of the crime speaks to the operational control Gotti maintained in those crucial days. However, the very public nature of the assassination ensured that the FBI and NYPD would never stop looking for ways to tie Gotti to the scene. While Castellano's killers might have been ghosts to the courts, they were very real to law enforcement, and every associate who came under pressure in subsequent years faced questions about Sparks. In the long run, the coup at Sparks Steakhouse became a case study in both the strengths and weaknesses of Gotti's leadership. His decisiveness removed an immediate existential threat to his position, but it also cemented his reputation as a boss willing to break foundational mafia rules when it suited him. That reputation would make alliances more conditional, trust more fragile, and enemies more patient in waiting for their moment to strike. The historian's lesson here is that the Mafia, for all its talk of loyalty and honor, has always been a shifting network of self-interest. Castellano underestimated how far Gotti would go to preserve his own power. Gotti underestimated how far law enforcement would go to dismantle his, and in the end both men's legacies were shaped not just by how they lived as bosses, but by how and where their conflict reached its climax, under the winter lights of Midtown Manhattan, in front of one of the city's most famous steakhouses. One of the fascinating dimensions of the Gotti-Castellano story is how quickly the mythology outgrew the reality. For years afterward, the hit at Sparks was retold in bars, social clubs, and even in popular culture as an almost cinematic act. Trench-coated gunmen disappearing into the snowy crowd, Gotti watching from a safe distance, Castellano falling without ever knowing who ordered it. The truth, as with most mafia history, is murkier. Law enforcement would later piece together a likely chain of events and participants, a combination of Gotti loyalists and skilled shooters drawn from allied crews. But in the 1980s, proving any of it in court was near impossible without someone flipping. That inability to close the case in the immediate aftermath only added to Gotti's legend, the boss who could order the most brazen murder in modern mob history and walk away untouched. This legend had value inside the family. It reinforced the idea that Gotti was untouchable, a man whose power could shield those who served him. For soldiers who had chafed under Castellano's detached management style, this was invigorating. They felt their boss was one of them, visible, accessible, willing to take risks. But there's a historian's warning embedded in that same narrative. Visibility in organized crime is a double exposure. The same light that shows your strength also shows your vulnerabilities. From 1986 onward, Gotti's reign was marked by a paradox. Internally, he maintained a tight grip on the Gambino family. Externally, the FBI's interest in him was relentless. prosecutors began framing cases not just to target individual crimes, but to construct an overarching RICO prosecution that could tie Gotti directly to acts committed by his soldiers. Sammy Gravano's role became more crucial during this period. As underboss, he absorbed much of the day-to-day operational management, allowing Gotti to focus on the image and politics of leadership. Gravano's ability to navigate both the construction rackets and the street-level operations kept the family profitable, even as law enforcement pressure increased. Yet, the seeds of the family's later unraveling were already there. Gotti's decision-making was increasingly shaped by loyalty tests and personal pride. Associates who questioned his orders risked being frozen out or worse. And while this kept dissent low in the short term, it also meant fewer voices urging caution when the heat was rising. Let's address the two major counterpoints from a historical analysis. Counterpoint 1. Castellano's death accelerated the Mafia's decline. The argument here is that by removing a boss who was committed to keeping the family low profile, Gotti invited the kind of media and federal attention that dismantled not only his own crew but weakened the commission's authority. Castellano's business-first approach, while unpopular with some soldiers, had insulated the Gambinos from the kind of sustained RICO assault that took down other crime families. Rebuttal. While Castellano's style may have delayed law enforcement focus, it could not have stopped it indefinitely. The FBI's coordinated Mafia Commission trial was already underway in 1985, targeting the very structure of the five families. Castellano's own legal troubles, including the infamous White House tapes, meant his days as an effective leader were numbered. Gotti's hit did not create federal interest, it merely shifted its target. Counterpoint 2. Gotti could have removed Castellano politically rather than violently. Some historians argue that Gotti, through alliances and patient maneuvering, might have used the Commission's own processes to oust Castellano without breaking the no-kill rule. By leveraging Castellano's unpopularity among street crews and his impending legal jeopardy, Gotti could have positioned himself as a natural successor when Castellano was inevitably convicted or forced to step down. Rebuttal. The flaw in this argument lies in timing. Castellano was already discussing Gotti's removal in response to drug charges tied to his crew. Once Della Croce died, Gotti lost his most powerful protector in the family hierarchy. Waiting for a political solution would have left him exposed to Castellano's retaliation. In mafia politics, hesitation often equals death. Gotti's preemptive strike was risky, but from his perspective it was the only survivable choice. By the late 1980s, the consequences of Sparks were fully visible. Gotti had become a household name, celebrated in tabloids, analyzed in documentaries, and even admired by some members of the public as a symbol of defiance against authority. But the same press clippings that elevated his status also became exhibits in court, reinforcing the prosecution's portrayal of him as the public face of organized crime. And then in the ultimate twist, the man who had helped him seize power, Sammy Gravano, would become the government's star witness against him, breaking the code of silence in exchange for a reduced sentence. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on multiple charges, including the Castellano murder, and sentenced to life in prison. From a historian's lens, it's tempting to see this as an inevitability. The man who thrived on visibility eventually became too visible to survive. But it's just as important to see the arc from Castellano's isolated White House to Gotti's public Ravenite office as a microcosm of the Mafia's own transition from an era of quiet corruption to one of noisy, media-drenched infamy. If there's a takeaway for viewers, it's this. In power struggles, the tactics that win the crown aren't always the tactics that keep it. Gotti's decisive move at Sparks Steakhouse cemented his place in mob history, but it also put the American Mafia on a collision course with a government that had finally learned how to dismantle it. Castellano's caution may have bought time, but it couldn't stop the tide. Gotti's boldness won the day, but it couldn't win the decades. The history of the mob is filled with these trade-offs, moments when survival today reshapes the dangers of tomorrow. And in December 1985, on a cold Manhattan sidewalk, those trade-offs were written in gunfire. So now you know the story, not just of a hit, but of a shift. When John Gotti took out Paul Castellano, he wasn't just making a power move, he was rewriting the rules of the Mafia, and in doing so, lighting the fuse on its eventual implosion. But what do you think? Was Gotti a bold genius who saved himself, or a reckless spark that burned the whole house down? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you want more Mafia history with no filters, and subscribe, because we've only scratched the surface, and I'll leave you with this: power wears out those who don't have it. Giulio Andreotti. Gotti had it, until it turned on him. See you in the next one.